Isabella Cruz hadn't spoken publicly about her father in years. Then, in a single unscripted moment, she said enough to send the internet into a full meltdown. Not a carefully worded PR statement. Not a ghost-written caption. A direct, personal statement. Her words, her voice, that landed like a grenade in the middle of Hollywood's most protected family story. Let's set the scene. Tom Cruise is, by almost any measure, the last surviving megastar of his generation. 3 decades at the top. Over $11 billion in global box office. A public image so carefully managed has survived divorces, lawsuits, leaked videos, and decades of tabloid warfare. He is very good at controlling his story, which is exactly what makes Isabella's statement so significant. Isabella, now in her 30s, living a deliberately private life in London, did not grow up in front of cameras by choice. She was placed in front of them. There is a difference. And for a long time, she said nothing about any of it. That silence had a shape. It had reasons. And according to people close to her, it had a cost. Because here's what most coverage missed entirely. Isabella's statement wasn't just about Tom Cruise the celebrity. It was about a daughter, a belief system, and a family structure that shaped her entire childhood, and from which she has spent the better part of a decade quietly, carefully, building distance. To understand what Isabella said, and why it hits so hard, you have to understand what her childhood actually looked like. Not the version on magazine covers. The real version. Isabella Cruz was adopted by Tom and Nicole Kidman in 1992, just months after they married. Connor followed a year later. From the outside, a fairy tale. But inside that family, there was a third presence that never left the room. Scientology. Tom Cruise is not just a celebrity member. According to a 2013 Tampa Bay Times investigation, he is considered the church's most important public figure. A man whose relationship with the church's leadership runs deeper than almost any outsider has ever seen. That matters here. Because Isabella and Connor were not raised in a household where Scientology was a Sunday practice. It was the architecture of their entire lives. Schooling, social circles, family decisions, all filtered through the church's framework. Former members have described how children raised inside high-profile Scientology families are surrounded, from a very young age, by a belief system that treats outside information, including therapy, certain medications, and non-member relationships, with deep suspicion. Isabella grew up inside all of that. And here is what nobody reported clearly at the time. When Tom and Nicole divorced in 2001, the split did not just separate a husband and wife. According to multiple accounts, including details in Leah Remini's 2015 memoir Troublemaker, it effectively separated the children from Nicole along lines that had everything to do with the church. Nicole Kidman is not a Scientologist. In the language of the organization, that classification carries weight. Kidman has spoken carefully about her relationship with Isabella and Connor over the years. In a 2018 interview with Oom magazine, she said she loves her children and that the door is always open. There was no anger, but there was distance. And she did not explain why. She didn't have to. Anyone paying close attention already understood. Isabella was a teenager navigating all of this. A famous last name she didn't choose. A belief system she was raised inside of. A mother she was growing apart from. A father who was one of the most protected public figures in the world. For years, most of her 20s, she chose the path that felt safest. She stayed quiet. She stayed inside the circle. But staying quiet has a shelf life. And by the time Isabella reached her 30s, settled in London, building a life far from Hollywood on her own terms, that shelf life had expired. Most people remember the Tom and Nicole divorce as a Hollywood headline. A power couple. A sudden split. Then, nothing. The story just stopped. And that stopping was not accidental. When Tom Cruise filed for divorce in February 2001, the legal proceedings moved with unusual speed. The settlement was sealed. Within months, the press had moved on. But what happened to Isabella and Connor inside that process has never been fully reported. Here is what we do know. Nicole Kidman has confirmed in multiple interviews that she does not have a close relationship with Isabella and Connor. She has never blamed them. She has never spoken against Tom publicly, but she has acknowledged, with careful, measured sadness, that something happened in that period that created a distance she has not been able to close. She won an Oscar in 2003, gave a speech that thanked almost everyone in her life. She did not mention her children. People noticed. Nobody asked why on camera. Leah Remini did ask in Troublemaker. Remini, a former church member, described how the organization's disconnection policy functioned around high-profile families. She wrote that members were quietly encouraged to limit contact with family members classified as suppressive persons, individuals considered hostile to Scientology's interests. Nicole Kidman, according to multiple former members who spoke to the Underground Bunker, held that classification in the years following the divorce. Remini has been careful to say what she witnessed directly. But the pattern she described, children in prominent Scientology families drifting from non-member parents following a divorce, aligned with accounts from other former members speaking to The Guardian and The Hollywood Reporter. Nobody from Tom Cruise's camp ever formally responded to those claims. That silence became its own kind of answer. And here is the part that changes everything. Isabella was not a passive figure. By her mid-teens, she was old enough to have her own standing inside the church. Leaving, or even questioning, would not just mean walking away from a belief system. It would mean walking away from every social connection she had ever built. Her community, her identity, the only version of normal she had ever known. That is the context most coverage skipped entirely. They reported the distance between Isabella and Nicole as a celebrity quirk. They did not report it as the outcome of a documented organizational policy operating inside one of the world's most famous households. Isabella moved to London in her mid-20s, away from Los Angeles, away from the celebrity center, away from the infrastructure of a life that had been built around her rather than by her. She built something quieter, something that was hers. And, for a while, it seemed like she had simply chosen privacy. But privacy and silence are not the same thing. In the years that followed, the distance between Isabella and her father was becoming something that even careful public image management could no longer fully conceal. By the time she settled permanently in London, Isabella had built a life that looked almost deliberately unremarkable. She married Max Parker, a musician, in 2015, in a small ceremony that Tom Cruise attended, according to People magazine. No red carpet, no press, just a wedding. It was one of the last times the two were publicly documented in the same space. What followed was not a dramatic falling out. No single moment captured by cameras. Instead, what emerged was a pattern. Isabella's social media, when she used it, contained no references to her father. No birthday posts. No proud daughter moments during Mission. Impossible press cycles. Nothing. For a celebrity family, that kind of absence is loud. People close to Isabella described a woman doing something genuinely difficult, quietly, without a support system most people would take for granted. She was re-evaluating everything she had been raised to believe. Not loudly, not with a tell-all interview, just privately, slowly, on her own terms. Most of us have been in a position where we realize that something we were handed, a belief, a relationship, a version of a story about who we are, was not entirely ours to begin with. The process of figuring out what you actually think versus what you were taught is not clean. It is not fast. And it does not come with anyone cheering you on. Isabella did that process in one of the most watched families in the world. Now here is the detail that most coverage glossed over entirely. Isabella did not suddenly post a manifesto. She did not call a journalist. What she did was quieter than that, and more deliberate. Over several years, she made a series of small, observable choices that told a story she never had to narrate directly. She stopped attending church events that had previously been part of her public schedule. She began speaking openly, in small online communities connected to her art, about concepts and therapeutic frameworks that are explicitly discouraged within Scientology's belief system. She started living publicly as someone who had left, without ever formally announcing it. According to the Underground Bunker, this pattern is not unusual. Many people who leave the church do not make a formal declaration. The exit is lived, not announced. Piece by piece, they rebuild a life outside the structure, until one day the structure simply no longer applies to them. For Isabella, that process spanned her late 20s and early 30s. And through all of it, the quiet rebuilding, the marriage, the London life, her father remained one of the most discussed figures on the planet, talking about family in careful, general terms that never quite acknowledged the specific shape of his. That gap between his public warmth and the private silence between them is what makes what happened next so striking. Because Isabella eventually stopped letting that gap go unaddressed. And when she spoke like someone who had nothing left to protect. Tom Cruise has never addressed Isabella's distance directly. Not once. In an era where every publicist has a crisis playbook, Tom Cruise has said absolutely nothing about the state of his relationship with his daughter. That is not an accident. To understand why, you have to understand how Tom Cruise manages his public image. It is one of the most sophisticated operations in Hollywood history. He does not do long-form print interviews that go off script. He does not appear on talk shows where hosts push uncomfortable questions. His press access is controlled, timed, and almost always tied to a project release cycle. When there is something he does not want discussed, it simply does not get discussed. A 2022 profile in The Atlantic noted that Cruise's media accessibility has narrowed significantly. Family, specifically his children and their relationship with Scientology, is never in bounds. But silence is a strategy with limits. Because the world keeps asking. Leah Remini has been the most prominent voice. In her Emmy-winning series Scientology and the Aftermath, she and other former members repeatedly discussed how the church influences family dynamics at the highest levels. Remini has said that the culture surrounding Cruise made it impossible for anyone in his circle to challenge decisions touching his family life. Nobody pushed back. And here is what nobody reported cleanly. The silent strategy works until the person you are being silent about decides to speak. Speaking the truth inside a powerful system is never free. There is always a price. For Isabella, the cost was not dramatic. It came the way most real losses come, slowly, in pieces, until one day you look around and realize how much is gone. She did not write a book. She did not sit down with Oprah. What she did was quieter and harder. Over years, she made public statements, through social media, through online communities, through the simple visible fact of how she was living, that made her position clear. She was no longer inside the belief system she was raised in. She was no longer performing closeness with a father she was not close to. The immediate consequence was social. Inside high-level Scientology circles, leaving, even quietly, triggers a specific response. Friendships go cold. Invitations stop. The community reorganizes around your absence. Isabella had built her social world inside that community. Losing it was a slow erasure. And then there is the relationship with her father. Tom Cruise has not publicly acknowledged her departure. He has not commented on the evidence that their relationship is not what his public image implies. He has simply continued. Premieres, press tours. The show continues. Isabella gave 20-plus years to a version of her life constructed around her father's world, his faith, his community. She did not choose Scientology. She was born into it. She built her identity inside its walls. And when she began quietly and at great personal cost to dismantle those walls, there was no press release from Tom Cruise expressing support, no public acknowledgement, no visible softening of the distance, just the same silence. Now what happens next? Because Tom Cruise is not a man who lets a narrative run without eventually responding. Here is where things actually stand. Not the version Tom's team would prefer. The actual picture of a family that has been quietly fracturing for years. Isabella is in her 30s. Lives in London with her husband. Makes art. Her social media is small, personal, and free of any reference to her father or the church. By every measure, she has built a life entirely her own. That is not a small thing. For someone who grew up inside one of the most controlled environments imaginable, Building something genuinely independent required dismantling almost everything she started with. She did it anyway. Connor Cruz presents a different picture. He remains visibly connected to Scientology and maintains what appears to be a functioning relationship with his father. He has spoken warmly about Tom. He fishes, lives quietly. He has not followed Isabella's path. That difference matters. 2 children, raised in the same household, inside the same belief system, by the same father, and they arrived at entirely different places. That is not a story about Scientology alone. It is a story about individual people making individual choices under enormous pressure. And then there is Suri. Suri Cruz, Tom's biological daughter with Katie Holmes, turned 18 in April 2024. According to People and Page 6, she quietly dropped the Cruz surname. She is now publicly identified as Suri Noel, her middle name. She did not make an announcement. She simply stopped using his name. Let that land. 2 daughters, different mothers, different circumstances, both in their own way, have made the same quiet declaration. They are building lives in which Tom Cruise, the icon, the brand, is not the central fact of who they are. The honest answer is, nobody outside that family knows. What we do know is this. Tom Cruise is now in his 60s. The window for rebuilding relationships with adult children who have spent years constructing independent identities is not infinite. It is narrowing. Isabella has spoken. Quietly, carefully, but clearly. Suri has spoken, through the simplest possible act. She removed his name. And Tom Cruise continues to perform the role of Tom Cruise with the same relentless commitment he brings to everything else. But here is the thing about performances. They require an audience willing to accept the version being offered. And the audience, slowly, piece by piece, with each new detail, is becoming harder to convince. Isabella's truth was not a bombshell dropped from a great height. It was quieter than that, more considered, more costly. It was the truth of someone who waited until she was stable enough to say it, until she had built enough of her own life that the saying of it could not take everything from her. She waited, she built, and then she spoke. Somewhere in London, in a life that does not have his name on it anymore, she is continuing to do exactly what she decided to do. Live honestly, without permission, without apology, without waiting for a response that, after all these years, may never come. The world heard her. Whether the one person who needed to hear it most ever does, is a question only one man can answer. And so far, he's still not talking.